And let me say at the outset, this design was proposed by Vitalik Buterin, who is also the founder of Ethereum. The ideas were sort of floating around for a while, for several years. And then I think the spec was formally written probably in 2018, and then sort of through 2019 and 2020, there was sort of increasing interest in getting this deployed. Okay. All right, so three main ideas in EIP 1559. Idea number one is going to be a reserve price. So in this context, it's going to be called a base fee. And as promised, it will indeed be informed by what's happened in the previous blocks, okay, by the outcomes of previous invocations of the mechanism. Now, wait a minute, you said. Didn't I argue that reserve prices don't work at all, right? You sort of have this violation of OCA proofness, and they have a side channel, and it's just like the reserve price is zero. Yes, all that's true. All that's true for the most naive way of implementing the reserve price, meaning you can continue to pass all revenue onto the miner of that block. But remember, we don't have to do that, right? So the protocol has tremendous flexibility over what happens to that revenue. And in fact, in the new transaction fee mechanism, all of the revenues generated from the reserve price, from the base fee, are burned, okay, are taken out of circulation. So EIP 1559, I mean, sometimes you hear people say it makes Ethereum deflationary, which is not quite right. It makes it less inflationary than it was before. Inflation naturally arises in blockchains like Ethereum because there's a block reward that's newly printed money that goes along with each block. And because of the burning that's been happening over the last couple of months, the inflation rate in Ethereum has been cut in half, okay? So I should say, like, the original motivation, as I understand it, is this new transaction fee mechanism was what I said, to make it easier for people to figure out what to bid. But it also, as a side effect, has a macroeconomic effect on sort of Ethereum, right, on its monetary policy, which a number of people are actually quite excited about that aspect as well, okay? So, but here, it's really the game theory that's driving it, right? We're not trying to sort of change the monetary policy. We really just sort of want a reserve price that actually is enforceable, that actually has bites. And what we'll see is that actually you can actually achieve OCA proofness as long as you don't pass this reserve price revenue onto the miner, as long as you do something else with it. The game theory is going to be the same no matter what else you do with it. In EIP 1559, it is burned, because that is how the current deployment works. Okay. All right, so good. So this is going to be this reserve price. We're going to burn the revenues. What is that reserve price going to be set to? I mean, I said it's going to be informed by what happened in the past, but how exactly? Well, in a perfect world, right, you would love a market clearing price such that exactly, so remember the block size in Ethereum is 15 million gas. Okay, gas is a measure of the sort of computational and storage cost of a transaction, and there's a budget of 15 million gas per block. So the ideal reserve price would be a market clearing price, where exactly 15 million worth of gas of transactions is willing to pay it, nothing more, nothing less. Because then your scarce resource would be fully allocated and allocated to the most valuable transactions, exactly the transactions that were willing to pay your reserve price. Okay. Now, you know, demand, both on a short time scale and a long time scale, is pretty volatile for a blockchain like Ethereum. So the market clearing price is changing. It's just, so, you know, it actually can change by a pretty large factor. Okay, sometimes it's high, sometimes it's low. So to, you know, if we're aspiring toward, you know, being close to this market clearing price, we're going to need to have an adjustment process. Okay, we're going to need to have a way for the base fee to rise in times of increasing demand, and conversely to fall in times of decreasing demand. And a natural idea is to use some kind of tâtonnement process. Okay, so to sort of observe excess demand. If excess demand is positive, raise the reserve price. Otherwise, you know, if the demand actually is less, the demand at the current price is less than supply, then you want to decrease the reserve price. But now, again, there's actually an interesting issue that comes up thinking about how we would implement this in Ethereum, which is, remember that only the winning transactions are recorded for posterity on chain. Okay, the losing transactions are not recorded. So if you're looking back at the most recent blocks, you know, and you see you've had a bunch of sort of full blocks in a row, 15 million gas. How can you differentiate between scenario one, where your base fee is exactly right, it's exactly the one you want, and exactly 15 million gather transactions are willing to pay it, versus your base fee being way too low? So you're seeing the lucky 15 million gas that got into the block, but what you don't see is that there might be 20 million more units of gas that did not get into the block. Okay? And if that were the case, you would want to be increasing your reserve price. So that brings us to key idea number 2, which is going to provide us with an on-chain signal about excess demand. All right. So this is another really actually quite significant modification to how Ethereum works, which is that it's now post EIP 1559 more flexible about block sizes. So in the old world, there was a hard cap. Every single block had to have size at most 15 million gas, and no exceptions. Now we're going to say, you know what, really, what matters is that we have amortized block size at most 15 million gas. So on average, over a decently long time window, we want to make sure that the average block size is at most 15 million. We don't necessarily care if the occasional block is more. The occasional block shouldn't be infinitely big, so we're going to still, it still keeps a maximum block size, which is double the target. So the target block size is going to be 15 million. It's not a hard cap. The hard cap is going to be 30. Okay. And so the point here is to really allow, to give the blockchain more flexibility, basically borrowing against its future capacity today, okay, if it's necessary, or if it's worthwhile to meet a sudden demand spike. Okay. And now what I want you to notice is, with this change, we actually can now have a reliable on-chain signal of whether the reserve price, whether the base fee is too high or too low. If the last block was bigger than the target, okay, so bigger than 15 million, could have been as big as 30, but if it was bigger than 15 million, that's more than we want. So I guess you better increase the reserve price to reduce demand at that price. Alternatively, if the last block is if the last block is too small, that means our reserve price appears to be too high. So we should decrease it. Okay, and so that's how the top-to-bottom process is going to work. Okay, it's really going to just look. So it's actually not going to look at the bids in the previous blocks at all. It's just going to look at how big the blocks were. Big blocks, price goes up. Small blocks, price goes down. Okay. There is a specific formula. For those of you that are curious, I put the specific formula here on the slide. This is not important, actually, for the economic guarantees I want to talk about today. But just for completeness, basically, if you ever see a double full block, for the next block, the base fee rises by 12.5%. If you ever see an empty block, the next base fee drops by 12.5%. And then you just linearly interpolate between those two extremes. And so that's what the update rule looks like right now. All right, so let me see a couple questions have come in. Got that one, total payments. Good, so CMAC, first of all, thanks for coming. Second of all, that's again, I think a good one for the end of the talk. I think it's a great question, very much off of sort of the shortest path through the talk. So I will get back to that as well. Thank you for the question. Okay, so key idea number 2, variable size blocks. Big blocks increase the price, small blocks decrease the price. We still need a third key idea though. And there's 2 reasons we need a third key idea, why we're not done. There's 2 things that should be bothering you. So first of all, if we're burning all the revenue, why should any miner bother to do anything? Why should they bother to solve these kinds of proof of work crypto puzzles? Well, okay, there's the block reward. Okay, so they're still going to get sort of no matter what, the block reward will be newly printed money. It'll still be given to the miner. So that's like $7,000 a block. So that's some motivation for bothering to solve these crypto puzzles. But on the other hand, like the block reward is independent of the contents of the block. So you can mine empty blocks, include no transactions at all, and collect the block reward. So why wouldn't miners just do that? What's their incentive to include any transactions at all? Question number 2 that you might be wondering about is like, what happens exactly if, the current reserve price is sufficiently low that the demand at that price is actually more than our hard cap of 30 million. So that's a really bad, that's the reserve price that's way off of the market clearing price, right? Market clearing would get us 15. We're saying not only are we sort of too low, we're so far too low that the demand is more than double our target. But that might happen, and what do, right? So now there's more transactions that want to get included at that price than we have room for. How do we pick among them? So we're going to answer both of those two questions with the same, third key idea, which is, in this new transaction fee mechanism, there's basically a first price auction kind of sprinkled on top. Really just sort of meant for emergencies. You sort of revert to the first price auction if you really need it. The terminology they use is tips. So the way it's going to work, if you submit a transaction now to Ethereum, it's actually a little bit more complicated. You now have to specify 2 bidding parameters. Previously, all you specified was 1. Just how much you're willing to pay. The way it works now is you submit 1 parameter, which is just the maximum you're willing to pay, right? That's what we're hoping is going to be like a private valuation. And then furthermore, so that's maximum willingness to pay to everybody. Because this is just the user is not willing to pay in sum more than this. And the user also specifies a tip, which is then transferred to the miner of that block, okay, like transaction fees were in the old days, okay? So in effect, for a given base fee, right, a user is bidding either like the base fee plus the extra tip it's willing to pay the miner, or its fee cap, whichever is smaller. Okay, so that's the bid induced by the choice of the fee cap and the tip with respect to a given base fee. Okay, and then as always, the revenue from the base fee, so the R, that gets burned. Whatever's left over, okay, either the tip or the residue, is going to be directed to the miner. Okay, and again, I encourage you to think of this as just kind of like a little mini first price auction layered on top of the base fee. And often when I get to this part of the design, I mean, I sense a feeling of disappointment from the people I'm talking to. Because I started the story by saying like we don't really like first price auctions. Right? It's sort of hard to figure out how to bid, and we'd like to do something better. And I get to this part of the design, and the natural reaction is like, but wait a minute, now we just have a first price auction all over again. But so here's the way to think about it. Okay, so this first price auction is only relevant when you have sort of an unexpected increase in demand. When things are operating normally, and the reserve price somewhere resembles the market clearing price. Maybe it's a little too low, so maybe you have not 15 million demand at that, but you have 18 million, whatever. You can pack the blocks up to 30 million. So as long as the base fee isn't way too low, you have adequate room in a 30 million gas block for everybody interested, everybody eligible at that particular base fee, right? And so at that point, you're actually in an uncongested setting, right? The eligible transactions are not competing with each other, so they can just bid something very small. Okay, they can bid, so something like sort of 2 Gwei. Gwei is sort of a unit of ether, and that's a small number. That would be a canonical thing you would bid. Now, once in a while, the reserve price might be sort of so low that you do wind up having to compete with people to get into the 30 million gas block. But then in that hopefully rare case, you're still no worse than the previous design. So the hope would be, 90% of the time, you don't have to reason about the tip at all. You just put some nominal tip. And then, the other 10% of the time, if you want to guarantee yourself immediate inclusion, well, yeah, then actually you do have to think like in a first price auction.